The gunshot that killed Jonah Dalton echoed across the plains of the Wyoming Territory on a bitter morning in October of 1878, but it was his own journal, discovered nearly a year later beneath a loose floorboard, that finally told his widow the truth of how he really died. Edith Dalton had not touched her husband's belongings for months after the funeral. The sheriff had ruled it an accident, a stray bullet from a hunting party that had strayed too close to the homestead, and Edith had accepted that ruling the way a person accepts a fever, with exhaustion rather than understanding. She had buried Jonah in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church in Larkspur Creek, a town of perhaps 400 souls tucked into the folds of the territory where the plains gave way to rougher country, and she had gone on living because there was nothing else a person could do. But grief has a way of loosening boards that have been nailed down tight, and one evening in late September of 1879, while searching for a moth-eaten quilt to patch against the coming winter, Edith's boot heel caught on a plank in the bedroom floor that had always seemed a fraction too loose. She knelt, more out of irritation than curiosity, and pried it up with the edge of a fire poker. Beneath it lay a leather-bound journal, its cover swollen with damp, and a small tin box containing $11 in silver and a folded letter addressed to no one at all. She sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with Jonah for 6 years and opened the journal with hands that had gone suddenly and strangely cold. The early pages were unremarkable, filled with notes about cattle prices and the weather and small tendernesses toward her that made her throat tighten. He had written of her laugh, of the way she hummed while kneading bread, of his hope that come spring they might finally have the child they had been praying for since their wedding. But as she turned the pages forward toward the entries from the weeks before his death, the tone of the writing changed. The handwriting grew tighter, more hurried, as though written by a man looking over his own shoulder. "I have seen something I should not have seen," one entry read, dated 3 weeks before he died. "Men from the Cross Anchor outfit driving cattle that do not carry their brand. I recognized old Tobias Whitfield's mark beneath the fresh iron, plain as day once you know to look for it. I do not know what to do with what I have seen. If I speak of it, I fear what will come of speaking." Edith read the passage 3 times before the meaning settled into her like a stone dropped into a well. The Cross Anchor Ranch was owned by Silas Merrick, a man of considerable wealth and considerable reputation in Larkspur Creek, a man who sat on the town council and donated generously to the very church where Jonah was buried. Tobias Whitfield was an old rancher who had died of a fever 2 winters past, his small herd supposedly sold off to settle his debts. If Jonah had seen Merrick's men rebranding Whitfield cattle, it meant theft on a scale that could ruin a man's name and send him to prison, or worse. She turned the page with trembling fingers. The entries grew darker still. Jonah wrote of being followed on the road to town, of a rider who kept pace with him at a distance for 3 miles before turning off toward the Cross Anchor spread. He wrote of Silas Merrick's foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Grady Hutch, stopping by the Dalton homestead under the pretense of borrowing tools, though Jonah suspected he had come only to see what Jonah knew and whether he intended to speak of it. "I fear I have made an enemy of a powerful man," the second-to-last entry read, dated the night before Jonah died. "I have decided I will ride to Cheyenne and speak with the territorial marshal there, for I do not trust the sheriff of Larkspur Creek to act against Merrick, who has done him too many favors over the years. I will tell Edith nothing of this until it is done, for I do not wish to frighten her, and if anything should happen to me, let this journal speak the truth I could not." There was no final entry. The last page was blank, the ink of an unfinished sentence trailing off into nothing, as though he had set down his pen intending to return to it and never had the chance. Edith closed the journal and sat very still in the gathering dark, the lamp beside her burning low, and she understood with a clarity that frightened her that her husband had not died by accident. He had been murdered, and the men responsible were still walking free in Larkspur Creek, tipping their hats to her on the street, sitting 2 pews behind her in church on Sunday mornings. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the small table in the kitchen with the journal before her and turned the letter over and over in her hands, the one addressed to no one, until finally she worked up the courage to unfold it. It was written in Jonah's careful hand and dated the same day as his final journal entry. To whoever finds this, it began, "If I am gone and this letter is read, know that I did not fall from my horse nor cross paths with a careless hunter. I have seen wrongdoing at the Cross Anchor Ranch, cattle stolen from a dead man's estate and rebranded for profit, and I fear that the men behind this scheme have discovered that I know. I go to Cheyenne to bring this before the law there, for I trust no one closer to home. If harm comes to me, let it be known that Silas Merrick and his foreman Grady Hutch are not the honest men this town believes them to be. Take care of my Edith. Tell her I loved her every day of our marriage and that my last thoughts, whatever comes, will be of her face." Edith wept then, for the first time in months allowing herself the full weight of her grief, but beneath the grief now burned something harder and more purposeful. She would not let her husband's death remain a lie the town told itself. She would find out the truth, and she would see justice done, though she had not the first idea how a widow alone might accomplish such a thing in a territory where the law bent easily to money and reputation. It was 2 days later, while riding into Larkspur Creek to purchase flour and salt, that Edith first spoke with Elijah Finley in any real way, though she had seen him about town for the better part of a year. He was a drifter of sorts, though that word did not quite fit him, for he had settled into steady work as a hand at the livery stable and had earned a quiet reputation as a man who kept his word and did not go looking for trouble. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall and lean with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, and he had a way of listening that made a person feel as though their words mattered more than they usually did. Edith's wagon wheel had come loose on the rutted road outside town, and she was standing beside it in some frustration when Elijah rode up on his bay gelding and dismounted without being asked, examining the wheel with the practiced eye of a man who had fixed 100 wagons before this one. "Nuts worked itself clean off, ma'am," he said, straightening up and touching the brim of his hat. "I believe I have a spare in my saddlebag that might do the job, if you will permit me." "I would be grateful," Edith said, and found herself studying his face as he worked, noting the careful way his hands moved, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the quiet hum he made under his breath that reminded her painfully of Jonah. "You are Mrs. Dalton," Elijah said as he tightened the wheel back into place. "I knew your husband a little, bought a horse off him once, a fine chestnut mare. He was an honest man in his dealings. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Edith said, and something in her chest tightened at the mention of Jonah's honesty, for it was that very honesty, she now believed, that had gotten him killed. "Mr. Finley, is it? I have seen you about the livery." "Elijah Finley, ma'am, at your service, such as it is." He smiled then, a brief and genuine thing, and helped her back up onto the wagon seat with a hand that was calloused but gentle. "You take care on this road. It is rougher than it looks, and I would not want to see you in a ditch." Edith rode the rest of the way into town with her mind turning over the encounter, and though she told herself it was foolishness to think of a stranger's kindness when she carried such heavy knowledge in her heart, she found she could not quite put the memory of his face aside. It was nearly a week later, after much anguished deliberation, that Edith decided she needed help if she was to pursue the truth about Jonah's death, for she could not ride to Cheyenne alone, and she certainly could not confront Silas Merrick or his foreman without putting herself in grave danger. She thought of the sheriff first, a heavy-set man named Amos Prout who had investigated Jonah's death and found nothing amiss, but the journal made clear that Jonah himself had not trusted Prout to act against Merrick, and Edith found she trusted her husband's judgment even now, perhaps especially now. She thought of her brother, who lived 2 territories away and could not be reached in time to matter. And she thought of the few women friends she had in Larkspur Creek, none of whom had the means or the courage to help her chase down powerful men on a matter of murder. In the end, it was the memory of Elijah Finley's steady hands and steadier eyes that brought her back to the livery stable on a cool October morning, the journal wrapped carefully in a cloth and tucked into her basket beneath a loaf of bread. As though she might convince herself, she had come only to visit a neighbor rather than to lay her husband's secrets before a man she barely knew. She found Elijah mucking out a stall, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked up at her arrival with open surprise that softened quickly into welcome. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, setting aside his pitchfork, "is something the matter with your wagon again?" "No," Edith said, and found her voice shaking despite her efforts to steady it. "Mr. Finley, I wonder if I might speak with you privately. It is a matter of some delicacy, and I do not know who else I can trust with it." Something in her tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the request, for Elijah's easy manner fell away and he nodded gravely, leading her to a quiet corner of the stable yard where a stack of hay bales offered a measure of privacy from the street. "You may speak freely," he said. "Whatever it is, I will keep your confidence." Edith drew the journal from her basket and held it against her chest for a long moment before she found the courage to speak. "My husband did not die by accident," she said. "I believe he was murdered, and I believe I know why, and I do not know what to do with what I have learned, for the men I suspect are powerful in this town, and I am only a widow with no one to turn to." She told him then of the journal, of the entries about the Cross Anchor Ranch and the stolen cattle, of Silas Merrick and Grady Hutch, of Jonah's plan to ride to Cheyenne and his death the very night before he intended to leave. Elijah listened without interruption, his jaw growing tighter as she spoke, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the stable yard as though weighing something heavy in his mind. "I have heard whispers about the Cross Anchor before," he said finally. "Nothing I could prove, mind you, but a man does not work around livestock in this territory for long without hearing things. There was talk after old Whitfield died that his herd sold for less than it should have, and that some of his cattle never made it to any buyer's ledger at all. I did not think much of it at the time. Ranchers cheat each other in small ways all across this territory, and it is not my business to sort out every rumor. But if Jonah saw it happening," Edith said, "if he could have proven it, and if that is why he was killed, then it is not a small matter at all." "No," Elijah agreed. "It is not small at all." He looked at her then, and something in his gaze held both sympathy and a kind of fierce resolve that steadied her more than any words could have. "Mrs. Dalton, I want you to know that I believe you, and I do not think you foolish for coming to me with this. If your husband was murdered to hide a crime, then justice is owed to him, and I will help you find it if you will have my help." Edith felt tears sting her eyes at the simplicity of his offer, given so freely to a woman he barely knew. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Finley." "Perhaps not," he said. "But I owe something to what is right, and I have never been able to look away from a wrong once I have seen it clearly. Besides," he added, a faint and gentle smile touching his mouth, "your husband sold me a fine horse and dealt with me honestly when he might have cheated a stranger passing through. I would like to see his memory honored properly." They agreed that evening to proceed carefully. Elijah counseled against approaching Sheriff Prout directly, for if Jonah had not trusted the man, they had little reason to trust him either, and word of their suspicions might travel quickly back to Merrick if Prout was indeed complicit or simply too cowed by Merrick's influence to act independently. Instead, Elijah suggested they gather what evidence they could on their own, quietly, before taking their findings to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, the very man Jonah had intended to see before his death. Over the following 2 weeks, Edith and Elijah met frequently, always with some pretense to explain their meetings to the watchful eyes of Larkspur Creek. For a widow spending time with an unmarried man would draw talk regardless of the purpose. Elijah, through his connections at the livery stable, made careful inquiries among the ranch hands who came through town, learning which of Merrick's men had worked at the cross anchor during the time of Whitfield's death, and which of them might be persuaded, quietly and for a price, to speak of what they had seen. It was during these weeks that Edith found herself falling into an easy companionship with Elijah that surprised her with its comfort. They would meet at dusk near the creek that ran behind her homestead, ostensibly to discuss their progress, but often their conversations wandered into gentler territory, memories of childhood spent in different corners of the growing nation, Elijah's years working cattle drives up from Texas before he had settled in Larkspur Creek seeking a quieter life, Edith's girlhood in Missouri before her family had come west seeking better land. "What brought you to settle here, of all places?" Edith asked him one evening as they sat on a fallen log near the water, the autumn air carrying the first sharp bite of the coming winter. Elijah was quiet for a moment, turning his hat over in his hands. "I lost my younger brother on a drive up from San Antonio some years back," he said finally. "A stampede at night, nothing anyone could have prevented, but I carried the weight of it a long while, thinking perhaps I should have kept better watch, should have seen the storm coming that spooked the herd. I drifted for a time after that, unable to settle anywhere, until I found myself in Larkspur Creek and discovered I did not want to leave. There is something about a place that lets a man breathe again after grief, if he gives it the chance." "I know something of that," Edith said softly. "I did not think I would ever breathe easy again after Jonah died. And then this journal, and now all of this, it feels as though grief has simply taken a different shape rather than leaving me at all." "Grief does not leave," Elijah said. "It only learns to walk beside you instead of standing in your way. I believe that is the best any of us can hope for." They sat together in silence after that, watching the water move over smooth stones in the fading light, and Edith found herself deeply, uncomfortably aware of how close his hand rested to hers on the log between them, and how much she wished, in some quiet corner of her heart that she was not yet ready to examine, that he might close that small distance. Their investigation soon yielded its first real breakthrough. A young ranch hand named Cyrus Beale, who had worked briefly at the cross anchor before being let go over some minor dispute, agreed to speak with Elijah in exchange for a few dollars and a promise of anonymity. Cyrus confirmed that he had seen, in the autumn of the previous year, cattle being driven into a remote box canyon on the northern edge of the cross anchor property, cattle that bore the faint scarred outline of Whitfield's old brand beneath Merrick's fresher iron. He had thought little of it at the time, assuming it was simply Merrick's business, but he admitted that Grady Hutch had warned him sharply against speaking of what he had seen to anyone, a warning delivered with enough menace that Cyrus had taken it seriously. He also mentioned, Elijah told Edith when he relayed this information, sitting across from her at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold before him, that around the time your husband died, there was talk among the hands that Grady Hutch had ridden out late one night with 2 other men, and had come back before dawn looking pleased with himself in a way that unsettled the others. Cyrus could not say for certain what business Hutch had been about that night, but the timing troubles me greatly. Edith felt the blood drain from her face. "You believe Hutch himself may have killed Jonah?" "I believe it is possible," Elijah said gently. "I do not want to frighten you further than you already are, Mrs. Dalton, but I think we must consider it, and I think it means we must be very careful in how we proceed from here. If Hutch or Merrick learn that we are asking questions, I fear what they might do to protect themselves." It was around this time that the danger of their undertaking became suddenly, frighteningly real. Edith arrived home one evening to find that someone had been through her house in her absence, drawers left slightly ajar, papers on Jonah's old writing desk disturbed in a way she was certain she had not left them. Nothing appeared to be missing, for she had taken care to keep the journal itself hidden on her person or with Elijah rather than in the house. But the violation left her shaking and unable to sleep, certain now that someone suspected what she was doing. She rode to the livery stable the next morning in a state of barely controlled panic, and Elijah, seeing her face, immediately abandoned the horse he had been shoeing and took her by the shoulders with a gentleness that steadied her more than words could have. "Tell me what happened," he said, and when she had explained, his expression darkened with a protective anger she had not seen in him before. "You cannot stay alone at that homestead," he said. "Not now. If they suspect you are looking into Jonah's death, they may come back, and I will not have you facing that danger without protection." "I have nowhere else to go," Edith said. "I cannot impose upon my neighbors without explaining why, and I will not put anyone else at risk by drawing them into this." Elijah was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as he considered the problem. "There is a small cabin on the edge of the Larkspur property, belonged to old Mrs. Hensley before she passed last spring. It has stood empty since, and I have keys to it through my work, for the livery has been storing tack there. It is not much, but it is close enough to town that you would not be isolated, and I could check on you regularly without drawing too much notice." "And what will people say," Edith asked, "when they learn a widow has taken up residence so near an unmarried man's watchful eye?" "Let them say what they will," Elijah said, with more heat than she expected. "Your safety matters more to me than gossip, Mrs. Dalton, and I think, if you will forgive my presumption, that it matters more to you as well, now that you have seen what these men are capable of." Edith agreed, though not without a flush of embarrassment at how quickly her heart had leapt at his vehemence, at the plain evidence that he cared for her welfare beyond the bounds of simple, neighborly duty. She moved her few essential belongings to the small cabin that same day, and though the arrangement drew exactly the kind of whispered speculation she had feared, she found she could not bring herself to regret it, not when she felt, for the first time since Jonah's death, that she was not facing the world entirely alone. The weeks that followed deepened both their investigation and, inevitably, the bond growing between them. Elijah visited the cabin nearly every evening, ostensibly to report on what he had learned or to ensure her safety, but their conversations stretched longer each time, drifting from the business of murder and stolen cattle into gentler, more personal territory. He told her of his mother, who had died when he was young, and of the father who had raised him and his brother alone on a hardscrabble farm in East Texas before the war had taken what little they had. She told him of Jonah, not just the manner of his death but the substance of his life, the small kindnesses and quiet humor that had made their marriage, if not passionate in the way of storybooks, deeply comfortable and true. "I do not think I ever loved him the way the songs describe," Edith admitted one evening, surprising herself with the honesty of the confession. "It was a good marriage, a kind one, and I grieve him truly, but I have wondered sometimes if there is a different kind of love I have not yet known." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, and in the lamplight of the small cabin, Edith could see something working behind his eyes, some careful weighing of words. "I think," he said finally, "that there are many kinds of love and none of them lesser for being different from another. But I will admit, Mrs. Dalton, that since I have come to know you these past weeks, I have found myself wondering about that different kind you speak of, and wondering whether I might have some part in helping you find it, when the time is right for such wondering." Edith's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with something neither was yet ready to name. "The time is not right," she said finally, though her voice trembled with an emotion that belied the caution of her words. "Not while Jonah's murder remains unanswered, not while I carry this grief and this danger both." "I understand," Elijah said, and though disappointment flickered across his face, he did not press further. "I will wait, Edith, for as long as waiting is needed. I only wanted you to know how I feel, so that you are not left wondering in the dark about my intentions." It was the first time he had called her by her given name, and the sound of it in his voice settled into her heart like a seed planted in fertile ground, waiting patiently for the season when it might finally be allowed to grow. Their investigation reached its crisis point in late November, when Elijah learned through his network of ranch hands that Silas Merrick was planning to drive a large portion of his herd, including the rebranded Whitfield cattle, to the railhead at Cheyenne for shipment east, an act that would effectively launder the stolen cattle into legitimate commerce and erase much of the evidence of the original theft. If they did not act before the drive departed, scheduled for the first week of December, the physical proof of Merrick's crime would be scattered across the nation's stockyards and lost forever. "We must go to the territorial marshal now," Elijah said, pacing the small confines of the cabin with an urgency Edith had not seen in him before. "We have the journal, we have Cyrus Beale's testimony, and I believe if we press him, Cyrus would be willing to speak formally to the marshal about what he witnessed and what Hutch said to him. It may not be enough to convict anyone of murder, not without more direct evidence, but it should be enough to at least halt the cattle drive and force an investigation into the rebranding, which might in turn uncover more about what happened to your husband. Then we must go to Cheyenne," Edith said, steadying herself with resolve. "I will not let them erase the truth the way they tried to erase Jonah." The journey to Cheyenne was some 90 miles by wagon, a 2-day trip that required an overnight stop at a small way station along the trail. Elijah insisted on accompanying her, both for her protection and because his testimony regarding Cyrus Beale's statements would carry weight with the marshal. Cyrus himself, after considerable persuasion and the promise of protection from any retaliation by Merrick, agreed to travel with them as well, riding a mule that Elijah had borrowed from the livery for the purpose. They departed Larkspur Creek before dawn on the last day of November, the journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth and secured in Edith's traveling bag. And though the weather held cold and gray, a light snow began to fall as they left the outskirts of town, Edith felt a strange lightness in her chest that she had not experienced since before Jonah's death, the lightness of finally moving forward after so many months of stagnant grief. The overnight stop at the way station, a rough but serviceable establishment run by an elderly couple who asked no questions of their guests, brought Edith and Elijah into a closeness neither had quite anticipated. Cyrus retired early to the small bunkhouse set aside for hired hands, leaving Edith and Elijah alone before the fire in the main room, the innkeeper's wife having provided them with simple bowls of stew and mugs of strong coffee before retiring herself. "Are you frightened?" Elijah asked her, watching the firelight play across her face. "Terrified," Edith admitted. "Not just of what we might find in Cheyenne, but of what happens after if Merrick learns what we have done before the marshal can act. A man who would kill once to protect his secrets would not hesitate to kill again." "I will not let harm come to you," Elijah said, his voice low and fierce with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "Whatever happens in Cheyenne, whatever comes after, I intend to see you safely through it, Edith. I have grown to care for you more deeply than I know how to properly express, and I could not bear to see you hurt." Edith turned to look at him fully then, the firelight catching the earnest lines of his face, and she felt something in her chest break open, some final wall of caution and grief giving way at last. "I have grown to care for you as well," she said softly. "More than I believed possible, given everything that has happened these past months. I think perhaps I have been afraid to say it, afraid that caring for you meant somehow betraying Jonah's memory, but I do not think that is true any longer. I think Jonah would have wanted me to find happiness again, and I think, Elijah Finley, that you may be the one to help me find it." Elijah reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her own, and for a long moment they simply sat together in the firelight, saying nothing more, for nothing more needed to be said. When he finally leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers, it was a kiss that carried within it all the careful weeks of their growing bond, tender and searching and full of promise for whatever future might lie ahead of them, once the shadow of Jonah's murder had finally been lifted. They arrived in Cheyenne the following afternoon, the territorial capital bustling with the particular energy of a railroad town, wagons and horses crowding the muddy streets between buildings of raw lumber, and the occasional more substantial brick structure that spoke of the town's growing permanence. The territorial marshal's office was located near the courthouse, a squat building of gray stone that seemed to promise a more serious application of justice than the casual sheriff's office back in Larkspur Creek. Marshal Thaddeus Cole proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, gray-bearded and weathered by decades of frontier service, and he listened to Edith's account with the journal spread open before him on his desk, his expression growing progressively grimmer as she read aloud the relevant passages and explained the significance of what her husband had witnessed. "Your husband was a braver man than most," Marshal Cole said when she had finished, closing the journal gently and setting it aside with something like reverence. "It takes courage to stand against a man of Merrick's standing, particularly in a territory where money often speaks louder than law. I have heard whispers about the cross anchor before, Mrs. Dalton, but whispers are not evidence, and I have had nothing solid enough to act upon until now." Cyrus Beale then gave his statement, his voice shaking with nervousness but his account clear and consistent with what he had told Elijah weeks before, and Marshal Cole took careful notes, asking sharp questions that tested the reliability of Cyrus's memory, but ultimately seemed satisfied with the young man's honesty. "This will be enough to secure a warrant," Marshal Cole said finally. "I can send a deputy marshal and a small posse to intercept the cattle drive before it reaches the railhead, and we can have the herd inspected for evidence of rebranding. If we find what you believe we will find, it will be enough to arrest Silas Merrick on charges of cattle theft at the very least. As for the matter of your husband's death, Mrs. Dalton, I must be honest with you that proving murder will be more difficult without a confession or a witness to the act itself. But an investigation into theft on this scale often unravels other secrets along the way, particularly if we can pressure the men involved to speak against each other in exchange for leniency." "Grady Hutch," Elijah said. "If he was the one who rode out that night, as Cyrus's information suggests, he may be persuaded to speak against Merrick if he believes he can save himself a harsher sentence." "Precisely my thinking," Marshal Cole agreed. "I will need you both and Mr. Beale here to remain available to testify formally once we have made our arrests. This may take some weeks to fully resolve, but I promise you, Mrs. Dalton, that I intend to see this through properly. Your husband deserves that much, and so do you." The deputy marshal and his posse departed Cheyenne the following morning, riding hard to intercept the cross-anchor cattle drive before it could reach the railhead and scatter its evidence across the nation's commerce. Edith, Elijah, and Cyrus remained in Cheyenne for nearly a week awaiting word, staying at a modest boarding house near the marshal's office. And it was during these anxious days of waiting that Edith and Elijah's love, already kindled, deepened into something neither of them any longer wished to hide or deny. They walked together each evening along the frozen banks of the creek that ran through the edge of town, bundled against the cold, talking of everything and nothing, of the life they might build together once the danger had passed, of children they might someday have, of the small homestead Elijah dreamed of establishing once he had saved enough to purchase land of his own rather than working another man's stable. Edith found herself imagining, for the first time since Jonah's death, a future that did not consist merely of enduring each day but of genuinely looking forward to what might come, and the imagining filled her with a joy so profound it sometimes brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "I did not think I would ever feel this way again," she confessed to him one evening as they sat together on a bench overlooking the frozen creek, the last light of sunset painting the sky in brilliant orange and violet. "After Jonah died, I believed my heart had simply closed itself off, that I would spend the rest of my days as a widow tending an empty homestead and growing old alone. And now here you are, and I feel as though I have been given a second chance at a happiness I thought I had lost forever." "You have given me the same gift," Elijah said, taking her gloved hand in his own. "I had resigned myself to a solitary life, believing that the grief of my brother's death had left me unfit for the kind of love that builds a family and a home. But you have shown me otherwise, Edith. You have shown me that grief and love can walk hand in hand, that a heart broken once can still learn to open fully again." He knelt then, right there on the frozen bank of the creek, and drew from his coat pocket a simple ring, unadorned but clearly chosen with care, a thin band of gold that must have cost him dearly given his modest wages at the livery stable. "I know this may seem too soon," he said, his voice unsteady with emotion, "given everything we have been through these past weeks, and given that Jonah's memory still deserves its proper mourning. But I love you, Edith Dalton, more fully and completely than I have ever loved another person in my life, and I do not wish to wait any longer than necessary to make that love known before God and before the world. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, once a respectable period has passed, once this business with Merrick has been properly concluded?" Edith felt tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold evening air as she nodded, unable at first to find her voice. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Elijah, I will marry you, and I will count myself the most fortunate woman in this territory to do so." He slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to pull her into an embrace that spoke of both passion and profound tenderness. And as they stood together on the frozen creek bank with the last light of day fading around them, Edith felt a happiness so complete it seemed to fill every corner of her heart that grief had hollowed out over the long months since Jonah's death. Word arrived from the posse 8 days after their departure, carried by a rider who brought both good news and troubling complications. The deputy marshal had successfully intercepted the cross-anchor cattle drive some 40 miles outside Cheyenne. An inspection of the herd had revealed exactly what Jonah's journal had described: dozens of cattle bearing the faint scarred outline of Tobias Whitfield's original brand beneath Merrick's fresher iron. Silas Merrick himself had been placed under arrest and was being transported back to Cheyenne to face formal charges of cattle theft, a crime serious enough in the territory to carry a substantial prison sentence. But Grady Hutch had not been among those taken into custody. According to the deputy marshal's report, Hutch had apparently gotten wind of the approaching posse, perhaps through some warning sent ahead by a sympathizer in Larkspur Creek, and had fled the drive 2 days before the interception, taking with him a fast horse and a considerable sum of money from the outfit's operating funds. His current whereabouts were unknown, though the marshal's office had sent word to neighboring territories to be alert for a man matching his description. The news left Edith with a complicated tangle of emotions: relief that Merrick would finally face justice for his crimes, tempered by fear that the man most directly responsible for Jonah's death, if her suspicions about that fateful night ride were correct, remained free and now had every reason to fear discovery and every incentive to silence anyone who might testify against him. "We must be careful," Elijah said grimly when the news reached them. "A cornered man is often more dangerous than one who believes himself safe. If Hutch believes we know of his involvement in Jonah's death, he may come looking for us before he flees the territory entirely, particularly if he believes silencing us might allow him to return to his old life once the immediate danger has passed." Marshal Cole shared this concern and insisted that Edith and Elijah remain in Cheyenne under a measure of informal protection until Merrick's trial had concluded, and Hutch had either been apprehended or confirmed to have fled beyond the territory's borders. This proved a wise precaution, for it was during this period of waiting, some 3 weeks into December, that Grady Hutch made his desperate and ultimately foolish attempt to eliminate the threat he perceived in Edith and the evidence she carried. He arrived in Cheyenne under cover of darkness, having apparently learned of their location through inquiries made at the Larkspur Creek livery stable before his flight, and attempted to break into the boarding house where Edith and Elijah were staying with the evident intention of retrieving or destroying the journal that had set the entire investigation in motion. But Elijah, sleeping lightly in the room adjacent to Edith's own out of an abundance of caution, heard the disturbance and confronted Hutch in the darkened hallway before the man could reach Edith's door. The confrontation was brief but violent, Hutch drawing a knife in his desperation, while Elijah, unarmed but larger and more level-headed, managed to wrestle the weapon from his grasp and subdue him with a well-placed blow before serious harm could come to either man. The commotion brought the boarding house proprietor and several other guests into the hallway, and within minutes, a deputy had been summoned to place Hutch under formal arrest. Edith emerged from her room to find Elijah nursing a shallow cut along his forearm where Hutch's knife had caught him in the struggle, and she rushed to his side with a cry of alarm that drew a tired but reassuring smile from him despite his obvious pain. "It is only a scratch," he said. "The blade caught nothing vital." "I am far more concerned with what this means for us now, for Hutch is in custody, and I suspect the marshal will have questions for him that may finally give us the answers about Jonah's death that we have sought all this while." Marshal Cole arrived within the hour to personally oversee Hutch's interrogation, and faced with the evidence of his attempted assault, along with the earlier testimony from Cyrus Beale and the damning entries in Jonah's journal, Grady Hutch's resolve crumbled entirely by dawn. He confessed, in a statement witnessed by Marshal Cole and two deputies, that Silas Merrick had ordered him to deal with Jonah Dalton after learning that Jonah intended to expose the cattle theft scheme, and that Hutch had followed Jonah on the road home from town on the night of his death, staging what appeared to be a stray hunting shot, but was in fact a deliberate act of murder intended to silence him before he could reach Cheyenne and the territorial marshal. The confession, delivered in full before witnesses whose testimony would hold weight in a court of law, finally gave Edith the closure she had sought since first opening her husband's journal beneath the loose floorboard of their bedroom. Jonah Dalton had not died in some meaningless accident of careless hunters. He had died because he had chosen to do what was right, because he had refused to look away from injustice even when doing so put him in mortal danger. And though the knowledge brought fresh grief in its wake, it also brought a measure of peace that had been entirely absent since his death, the peace of finally knowing the truth rather than living with a lie. The town had told itself to avoid confronting the power and corruption of men like Silas Merrick. Both Merrick and Hutch stood trial in Cheyenne in the early weeks of January of 1880, the territorial court convening a jury of local citizens who heard the full account of the cattle theft scheme and the murder it had precipitated. Edith herself testified, reading passages from Jonah's journal before the court with a steady voice that surprised even herself, given the weight of grief and vindication that filled her as she spoke her husband's own words aloud for all to hear. Elijah testified as well, describing the investigation that had led them to Cheyenne, and Cyrus Beale repeated his earlier statement with the added confidence of a man who had seen justice beginning to take its course. The jury's verdict, delivered after only a few hours of deliberation, found both men guilty as charged, Merrick of cattle theft and conspiracy to commit murder, Hutch of the murder itself, along with his attempted assault on Elijah during the failed break-in. The presiding judge sentenced Merrick to 15 years in the territorial prison, his considerable wealth and standing in Larkspur Creek offering no protection against the weight of evidence arrayed against him, while Hutch received a sentence of hanging, the severity of the punishment reflecting both the premeditated nature of Jonah's murder and the additional charge of attempted violence against Elijah in Cheyenne. Edith felt no particular satisfaction in the harshness of these sentences, only a quiet and profound relief that the truth had finally been established beyond doubt, that Jonah's memory would no longer be tainted by the false narrative of accidental death that had allowed his true murderers to walk free among the people of Larkspur Creek. She wept when the verdict was announced, not from sorrow, but from the release of a burden she had carried since first discovering the journal beneath the floorboard, a burden of uncertainty and injustice that had weighed on her spirit far more heavily than she had allowed herself to fully acknowledge until it was finally, completely lifted. They returned to Larkspur Creek in late January, the journey back feeling entirely different from the anxious flight to Cheyenne some 2 months before. The town received them with a mixture of relief and shame, relief that a genuine injustice had finally been exposed and corrected, shame that the community had so readily accepted the false explanation for Jonah's death, and had, in some small way, allowed Merrick's wealth and influence to obscure the truth for so long. Sheriff Pruitt himself came to Edith's homestead to offer his apologies for his earlier failure to properly investigate Jonah's death, admitting with evident discomfort that he had perhaps been too quick to accept the convenient explanation offered by Merrick's allies among the town's more prominent citizens. "I do not hold it against you, Sheriff," Edith told him, and found that she meant it truly, for the anger that might once have fueled such a confrontation had burned itself out during the long weeks of investigation and trial, leaving only a tired but genuine capacity for forgiveness. "We none of us wish to believe that a man of Mr. Merrick's standing could be capable of such wrongdoing. I only hope that this experience teaches us all to look more carefully at power and wealth before assuming they walk hand in hand with virtue." The wedding of Edith Dalton and Elijah Finley took place in the spring of 1880, in the same small Baptist church where Jonah had been laid to rest. A choice that some in the town might have found strange, but that felt entirely right to Edith herself. A way of honoring both the love she had shared with her first husband and the new love that had grown, unexpected but profound, from the ashes of that earlier grief. The church was filled with well-wishers from throughout Larkspur Creek, for the story of Edith's courage in uncovering the truth about Jonah's death, and of Elijah's steadfast devotion in helping her achieve justice, had spread throughout the territory and earned them both a measure of local admiration that neither had particularly sought, but that they accepted with grateful humility. Cyrus Beale attended as an honored guest, having secured steady employment at a neighboring ranch on the strength of his courage in testifying against his former employer, and Marshal Cole himself made the journey from Cheyenne to witness the wedding of the couple whose case had occupied so much of his attention over the preceding months. Edith wore a simple dress of pale blue, and as she walked down the aisle toward Elijah waiting at the altar, she felt none of the conflicted grief that might once have accompanied such a moment, only a clean and complete joy in the life that lay ahead of her. "I take you, Elijah Finley," she said during the exchange of vows, her voice clear and steady in the quiet church, "not to replace what I have lost, but to build something new and precious alongside the memory of what came before. I love you with a whole heart, unburdened at last by the lies and injustices that once threatened to consume it entirely." Elijah's own vows, spoken with the same earnest conviction that had first drawn her to him during those anxious weeks of investigation, promised a lifetime of partnership and protection, of shared labor and shared joy, of a home built on honesty rather than the secrets and silences that had once nearly cost them both everything. They settled together on a small parcel of land just outside Larkspur Creek, purchased with the modest savings Elijah had accumulated during his years at the livery stable, combined with the proceeds from the sale of Jonah's old homestead, which Edith had decided, after much consideration, that she could not bear to continue living in given all it had witnessed. The new homestead, though humble, became a place of genuine happiness for them both. A small cabin gradually expanded as their means allowed, surrounded by a modest herd of cattle that Elijah tended with the same careful diligence he had once applied to solving the mystery of Jonah's death. Their first child, a son they named Jonah Elijah Finley in honor of both the husband Edith had lost and the man who had helped her find justice for that loss, arrived in the winter of 1881, born during a snowstorm so fierce that Elijah had been forced to ride nearly 10 miles through blinding conditions to fetch the midwife from town, a journey he later described as more frightening than any confrontation with Grady Hutch had ever been. The boy grew strong and healthy despite the harsh circumstances of his birth, and Edith found in the raising of him a joy that seemed to complete the healing that had begun the day she first opened her husband's journal and set out on the path that had ultimately led her to Elijah. A daughter followed some 2 years later, named Sarah after Elijah's own mother who had died so many years before in Texas, and the small homestead gradually filled with the sounds of children's laughter that Edith had once feared she would never know, given the childless years of her first marriage and the grief that had followed Jonah's death. Elijah proved as devoted a father as he had been a suitor, teaching young Jonah to ride almost before the boy could properly walk, and cradling infant Sarah with a tenderness that never failed to bring tears to Edith's eyes when she witnessed it. The years that followed brought their share of the ordinary hardships common to homesteading life in the territory: harsh winters and dry summers, occasional setbacks with cattle prices and crop yields, the constant labor required to build a life from raw land in a still-developing frontier. But these hardships were born together, shared burdens that only deepened the bond between Edith and Elijah rather than straining it. And Edith often reflected, during quiet evenings by the fire with her husband and children gathered close, that she could not have imagined a fuller or more satisfying life than the one that had grown from the terrible discovery of Jonah's journal. She kept that journal still, stored carefully in a cedar box along with other mementos of her first marriage, and she made a practice of reading passages from it to her children as they grew older, not the darker entries that had revealed Jonah's murder but the earlier, gentler ones that spoke of his hopes and his love for the wife he had left behind. She wanted her children to know that their mother's heart had room enough for two great loves, that grief and joy could coexist within a single life without diminishing either, and that the truth, however painful to uncover, was always worth the courage it demanded. Silas Merrick died in the territorial prison some 7 years into his sentence, never having expressed genuine remorse for his crimes, according to the occasional reports that reached Larkspur Creek through the territorial newspapers. Grady Hutch was hanged in Cheyenne in the spring following his conviction, his execution witnessed by a small crowd that included, at her own insistence, Edith herself, who felt she owed it to Jonah's memory to see the man who had murdered him face the final consequence of his actions. She felt no satisfaction in witnessing the hanging, only a solemn sense of completion, of a circle finally closed after so many months of uncertainty and grief. Tobias Whitfield's estate, it was later determined through the legal proceedings that followed Merrick's conviction, had been substantially defrauded by the cattle theft scheme, and a portion of the recovered assets from Merrick's confiscated property was eventually distributed to Whitfield's surviving relatives, a niece and nephew who had moved to the territory some years after their uncle's death and had no knowledge of the injustice that had been done to his memory until the trial brought the full truth to light. Edith took some comfort in knowing that justice had extended beyond merely punishing the guilty to also, in some small measure, correcting the material wrong that had been done to an innocent man's legacy. Larkspur Creek itself changed in the years following the trial, the exposure of Merrick's corruption prompting a broader reckoning with the ways that wealth and influence had too often been allowed to override honest justice in the young territory. Sheriff Prout, chastened by his earlier failures, became noticeably more diligent in his duties, and the town council, no longer under Merrick's considerable influence, began to take more seriously the complaints of smaller ranchers and homesteaders who had previously felt powerless against the machinations of men like the disgraced rancher. Edith liked to believe that some small part of this positive change owed itself to her husband's courage in first recognizing the wrongdoing at the Cross Anchor Ranch, and to her own courage in refusing to let his death be forgotten as a mere accident. By the time their third child arrived, a second son they named Thaddeus in honor of Marshal Cole, whose diligent pursuit of justice had made possible the resolution of Jonah's murder, Edith and Elijah's homestead had grown into a modest but thriving operation. Their small herd of cattle expanded through careful breeding and honest dealing, their reputation in Larkspur Creek solidly established as people of integrity and quiet strength. Neighbors who had once regarded Edith with pitying sympathy after Jonah's death now regarded her with genuine respect, admiring the resilience and courage she had shown in uncovering the truth and building a new life from its painful revelations. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Edith and Elijah rode together to the small cemetery behind the Baptist church, as they had made a practice of doing each spring, to tend to Jonah's grave and to lay fresh flowers upon it. Their children, now numbering 4 with the recent addition of a younger daughter named Grace, accompanied them on this pilgrimage, having grown up understanding the full story of their mother's first husband and the courage that had marked both her grief and her eventual healing. "I think of him often," Edith told Elijah as they stood together before the modest headstone, the spring wind carrying the scent of new growth across the quiet cemetery. "Not with the sharp grief I once carried, but with a kind of gratitude for the goodness of the man he was and for the courage his memory demanded of me. I do not think I would have found you, Elijah, if I had not first been forced to seek justice for him." "Then I owe him a debt I can never fully repay," Elijah said, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders as they had stood together so many times before. "For without his courage in facing down Merrick's wrongdoing, and without your courage in uncovering the truth of what happened to him, I would never have known the joy of loving you, Edith, or of building this life we share together." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching their children play among the gravestones with the innocent disregard for mortality that only childhood allows, and Edith felt, as she often did during these quiet moments of reflection, a profound sense of peace with the winding path that had brought her to this life, this love, this family that filled her days with purpose and joy she had once feared lost forever. The journal itself remained a treasured possession throughout the remainder of Edith's long life, passed eventually to her eldest son Jonah when he came of age, along with the full story of the grandfather he had never known and the mother whose courage had ensured that his death would not go unavenged. The story of Edith Dalton and Elijah Finley became something of a local legend in Larkspur Creek over the passing decades, told and retold as an example of how truth, however deeply buried, would eventually find its way into the light, and how love, however unexpected its origins, could grow from even the darkest soil of grief and injustice into something lasting and beautiful. Edith Dalton Finley lived to see her grandchildren grow, watching the small homestead she and Elijah had built together expand into a substantial ranch that supported 3 generations of their family. And she often told her grandchildren, gathered around the fire on winter evenings much as she once had with her own children, the story of how she had discovered the truth about her first husband's death buried in his own journal, and how that terrible discovery had ultimately led her to the greatest love and happiness of her long and richly lived life. She died peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1924, at the age of 71, with Elijah, then 75 and still devoted to her after more than 4 decades of marriage, holding her hand as she passed, and with the journal that had begun their extraordinary journey together resting, as it always had, in its cedar box nearby, a testament to the courage and love that had defined both their lives.